Buongiorno and welcome to the Author's Preface, the show where we hear the story behind the story and find out how authors are forged. I am your host, Sam Hale. So what's good with me? Well, by the time you hear this, two things will have happened. One, I will have turned 40 years old over the hill. And the second, I will have finished a third draft of my novel. It's always exciting. Of course, that last chapter, emotional, fulfilling. I always have a little ritual because I wasn't sure if I could finish that first draft, and then my cat died. Loved my cat, Chester. And then only about four or 5 years after I adopted my little dude, he passed away from a blood clot. And I was so close to finishing that first draft and when this happened, and unsure if I was going to finish it. And when this happened, I decided, you know what? I'm going to dedicate this to Chester. I'm going to get this done. So after I finished that first draft, damn, was that tough. My God. Just the writing of the whole thing, and then, of course, losing my friend. I looked up at his box of ashes, looking at him right now, actually. I have his little collar, too. It sounds like this. That's Chester's collar. I thanked him because I truly do believe that every problem or every tragedy is an opportunity for growth. I have to believe that because life is full of suffering or inconveniences, and there's always an opportunity for growth, the potential for possibility if we're going for alliteration. So I'm almost finished with this third draft, and when I'm done, I'm going to look up at Chester's ashes, I'm going to hold his collar, and I'm going to thank my little friend. Because even though it was sad, tragic for me, very abrupt how he passed away, we went from playing to putting him down within an hour. I believe it happened for a reason. I'm not a super frou-frou, woo-woo kind of guy. I do believe, though, that things happen for a reason. It's our choice to take advantage of these opportunities. So when I'm finished with that draft, I'm going to look up at his urn. I'm going to thank him and just be grateful that even though this was a tragic thing, it's brought me to this point. So I'm excited to turn 40. It's another year of promise. I get to eat Korean food on my birthday with all my friends, and any excuse to eat Korean food is an opportunity I welcome with open arms. I used to live in South Korea, and if I was stranded on an island and I could only have one food all my life, I would choose Korean without hesitation. Just damn good food. Anyway, turning 40, finishing the novel, gonna eat Korean food, have a little bit of soju as well, and I'm gonna enjoy myself just as much. Check out these transitions, by the way, come on. Just as much as I enjoy my conversation with Evelyn Puerto. So who is Evelyn? She's an epic fantasy and memoir writer. Notable works include the Outlawed Myth Epic Fantasy Series. I read Flight of the Spark, the first book in that series, as prep for the pod. Her accolades, awards, all that stuff include a reader's favorite silver medal for Flight of the Spark, which was also an Indie Brag Medallion honoree. Sting of the Scorpion received a Best Fest second place in Epic Fantasy and third place in YA Fantasy. And then Beyond the Rapids, a reader's favorite bronze medal. As far as education, Evelyn has a master's in healthcare administration, which she worked in for 10 years, and then became a missionary going to Russia to do humanitarian aid for 7 years. Evelyn loves hiking, kayaking, and entertaining the grandchildren who love chasing bugs. I will have all of Evelyn's socials, links, all that stuff in the show notes, and a detailed breakdown in the outro of the pod. But if you want to get right to it, her newsletter, subscribe.evelynpuerto.com. Speaking of which, there are a ton of goodies in this pod. Links to very knowledgeable writers, whether you're going for trad publishing, self, all that good stuff. I'll make sure those are in the show notes as well. And what did Evelyn and I discuss? We started out with her life in healthcare admin and how, like I mentioned earlier, she found herself in Russia soon after the Berlin Wall fell. I was only a kid at the time. We discuss it, as well as how I totally flubbed the date when that happened. And just her experience there, and obviously how different it was coming from a land of plenty in the United States to a country that was already struggling before the fall of the Soviet Union and what life was like in the aftermath. She also describes her experience writing a memoir having to do with folks in Ukraine, as well as the persecution some of those folks encountered. There's also an excellent anecdote she tells about the collectif in Russia. It was one of the reasons I traveled as much as I possibly could before my disability really started getting in the way of that. I recall seeing a lady with numerous kids living at the edge of a river that was essentially runoff from sewage, living in a corrugated tin hut, and thinking, my God, I am a very lucky person. I have a lot to be grateful for. Briefly discuss the paralyzing effect of perfectionism, which, as I'm fond of saying, perfect is the enemy of done. If you're writing, painting, making a film, whatever it is, just remember, perfect is the enemy of done. Evelyn's very articulate. The way she expresses her ideas, it just reads well. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So without further delay, let's get to Evelyn Puerto's preface. And I am here with Evelyn Puerto. Evelyn, thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So I'll have given an intro at the beginning of the pod, but for people who have skipped past that, can you just give us a rundown of what it is you write, publications, things like that?
Sure. I write epic fantasy, and I have published a series of 4 novels. It's called the Outlawed Myth Series. And the first one is Flight of the Spark. And that's basically it. Epic fantasy is the big thing.
All right. Well, I'm really interested to hear your preface, so let's get right to it. So, the old world, Evelyn, prior to taking the deep dive into writing, were you fulfilled in life? Was there something missing? And if so, did you know what that was?
I had taken a long road to becoming a writer. I had a master's degree in hospital administration. I worked in healthcare for 10 years. And I loved my career. I loved that field. That was very fulfilling. Then the Berlin Wall went down, and I got very fascinated watching all of those countries just change governments in Eastern Europe. And I was thinking, somebody needs to help these people rebuild their societies. Well, the short version of that story is 5 years later, I was in Russia as a missionary doing humanitarian aid with doctors and hospitals. And that was very fulfilling and rewarding in and of itself. But then after 7 years, I came back. I had a stateside role with my agency, and I knew that was temporary. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. I was thinking I was going to go back to management as a profession, whether in healthcare or not for profit management. I wasn't sure, but that was the direction I was sure I was going. Writing was really not on the radar, except for one thing. During the years I was in Russia, the church I had gone to in St. Louis would take a team to Ukraine, to Zaporozhye, Ukraine, and they would do a children's camp and a medical clinic and some other projects. And the years I was in Russia, I would go down and meet them. I was the extra interpreter, and I would help in the medical clinic and did whatever they needed. Well, there was this amazing family there. The father had been a Baptist pastor during the time of the Soviet Union, and not only he had been persecuted, but his wife and children as well. I mean, even through the schools, his children were persecuted because they were part of this family. And they all had amazing, amazing stories. Well, after I got back to the States, this woman who had gone there cornered me one day and said, "You need to write a book about this family." And I said, "No, thank you. I'm not a writer." And she said, "Oh, but you know the family, you know the people, you know the culture. You can write this in a way that an American family would understand it, or an American people would understand it." And I said, "No, thank you. I'm not a writer." Well, a few other things happened along the way, and I won't go into all of that. But the upshot is I agreed to write this book. So I was thinking, as I was readjusting to life in the States, trying to figure out where I was going with my career, I'll just write this book. How hard can it be? Just write down the people's stories and I'm done and move on with my life. So there you have it.
I don't even know where I want to start here because People who've been listening to the podcast already know I'm a history buff. What is it? 1991 that the wall falls?
1989.
1989. It was off part a couple
You were
years.
close.
Ballpark. I think I was about 10 years old. I remember watching this on the news. My parents kind of, everybody gathered around
Yeah.
and we watched, people hammering away at it with pickaxes and everything. So you're there pretty soon after the wall falls. Obviously, that was monumental for the whole world. I mean, the Soviet Union is falling apart. All the satellite states, like you mentioned, are suddenly trying to find their own way. It's self determination. And it's fascinating. Gradually, not just the event itself, but the experience of being in a post Soviet Union Russia, did it find its way into your storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of the world of Flight of the Spark is based loosely on the Soviet culture. The idea that you had to think the same way. That was the biggest thing. And that's what I realized from it. It was this pressure to conform your thoughts. I had friends that had been factory workers during that time. And they all said, we just took stuff home. One woman had 100 clocks in her house. She worked in a clock factory and she just took them home when she felt like it. That was perfectly acceptable behavior. But to think something different, you're off to the gulag.
Mm-hmm.
So in Flight of the Spark, I really tried to bring that out, that you had to think the same, dress the same, be the same. You had to conform. And that was that society's way of ensuring peace with their neighbors, but peace among the population.
And there's definitely a sense of docility being imposed on the people. I mean, talking about the dress, drab gray, uniform in every possible sense. The houses are more or less the same. The food is pretty bland.
Bland, yes.
Yeah, malnutrition being a pretty issue among people in the Soviet Union as well as China during the Great Leap Forward, for example. Is there anything else about that that really affected you, not just in terms of writing, but worldview, for example?
Worldview, definitely. It really made a big sensitivity within me when I hear people saying, you can't think that way. Well, that kind of gets my back up. Just because I think something, it doesn't hurt you. We need to be able to talk things out and convince me I'm wrong. Don't just shut me down. Explain to me why I'm wrong. Or I can explain to you why I think this. And we may see logic in the other's opinion and the other's argument, but still come to a different conclusion. But we just don't shut each other down. Another thing was I learned a very important principle about world building, and I'll tell you a little story about this. So, one of the things in Russia at that time, and I know it has changed since then, but this is the early to mid 90s, every store closed between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. And that was the employees' dinner break, is what it was called. Well, if you wanted to buy bread or anything else, you had to make sure you were there before 2 or after 3. And one day I was a few minutes late getting to the store and I missed the 2 o'clock and I had no bread at home. And I went home in quite a irate state, shall we say. And I think it was winter and I had to go back out in the cold an hour later and get my bread. And anyway, I was just very agitated. So the next day, my language teacher came and I ranted to her about this problem. And I'm coming from the American customer service viewpoint of we are serving customers. We want to increase sales. Why would we shut down for an hour in the middle of the day? So I'm telling her all this. And she said, well, you just don't understand. They have to close down for an hour. It's the employees' dinner break. And I'm like, well, so? She says, well, they have to mop the floor. Okay, I can give them that a little bit, that in winter in Russia, everybody's trekking in all this snow on their boots and it melts and there's these big piles of slush on the floor and they have to clean it up. But surely they don't have to shut the whole store down. And she says, well, they have to restock the shelves. And I'm like, no store in America has a problem restocking the shelves. And all the shelves in these stores, and they're not big stores, there's just shelving around the perimeter and then counters in front of the shelves. And employees stand behind the counters and they take things off the shelves to give to the customers. So it's not like restocking would block anybody's walking through the store. So that argument didn't wash with me. So then she said something that started to make sense. She said, well, these stores do not have a place to cook food or have a refrigerator. And most people are relying on the trolley bus to get home, and they don't have time in an hour to go all the way home, cook a meal, and come back. And in Russia, in the winter especially, you really want a hot meal because there may not even be heat in the store. So you really need this. And most of these stores, what they do is they pay somebody to bring in the food. And if you don't eat at the same time, then you're not getting a hot meal. And I'm like, okay, that's beginning to make sense. I don't see a way around that too easily. But then she said the important thing. She said, and that's when the collective forms. This idea of the collective, it's the work group. And the way society worked was you were dependent on your contacts, your family, and your other people you knew. And your collective, if you had a good collective, that was your lifeline. So if your toilet was leaking and you needed it fixed, you could call up the government agency that handled that and hoped that in a week or so they'd send somebody over who might or might not be drunk, may or may not know what they're doing, and may or may not extract a bribe from you to get your toilet fixed. But if you go through your collective, your coworkers, neighbors, sister might be a plumber, and they can arrange to have somebody come over quicker and do the job and not be drunk and not demand bribes. That was how everything worked. And that's what made sense to me. It wasn't so much that they had to mop the floor. It was that these employees, everybody understood the importance of you needed these people to survive in that environment. And that was where those bonds, those personal bonds formed when you ate lunch with them every single day. And the principle for world building was that no matter how bizarre something seems, there is a logical reason behind it that makes sense to the people in the culture. So that's something that I've had to really think through as I come up with, well, how did they do this in this culture? Well, why do they do it? And what's their reason? And another person from another culture, why would they not understand that? And so to create those layers in the world building.
Evelyn, I always like to ask if there was a book or series of books for that matter, an author, someone who influenced you to not only, for a lot of us, start reading. For me, it was Brian Jakes who really got me into fantasy and reading to begin with. Was there that kind of book or person in your life?
Well, I've always been an avid reader, and I would drive my mother crazy to take me back to the library so I could get another 10 books out and read them, and I'd have them read in 3 days, and then she'd be mad because I would be begging to go back again. Narnia, the red and blue fairy books, and Lord of the Rings, those are things I read over and over and over and just loved. I never really wanted to be a writer. I did try a couple times to write things, but like in school, I hated it. I hated writing so much. I would put it off to the last minute. I'd be writing my papers on the school bus on the way to school. I just hated it. And funnily enough, in high school, I took a creative writing class, and the teacher loved to enter our work into contests. And one of my poems won a contest. And on the strength of that poem, a small school in Virginia offered me a scholarship, a full scholarship as a writing major. And being a somewhat short sighted 17-year-old, I said, I don't want to be a writer. So keep your money. And I don't think I ever told my parents about that. And probably a good thing. I don't think they would have thought that was a good decision. Yeah, as I had said, I started writing that book about that Ukrainian family. And as I got into it, I just started to love the process and started realizing that when the writing is something that's coming from me, it becomes a labor of love and not this school project that I know I'm going to get graded on and am dreading that kind of evaluation.
The parallels here are they're spot on in that anytime I had to write, well, obviously I wasn't interested in, I'm not going to produce something very interesting. But when in fifth grade, I remember it was a really formative moment for me. I was asked to write a history report, and I just, for whatever reason, chose Genghis Khan. I wrote like a 3-page paper that was supposed to be 200 words, and my parents were blown away and loved it. But that didn't happen again until college because you get to choose what you want to learn
Right.
initially, at
Right.
least in the US. And for so many of us, that seems to be the case. I don't know about you, but a bit of a resentment towards the public education system. And
Right. I guess the thing is, when I started moving into more thinking about writing and especially writing fiction, I really thought about what are the books that resonate with me and why do I go back and read them over and over and over? And that's the kind of thing I was looking to see if I could produce myself.
Doubts, Evelyn. Were there any kinds of either external or self imposed doubts you encountered, obstacles that were keeping you from taking writing as seriously as you may have liked?
I think a big thing was I seriously underestimated how much I needed to learn. I had this idea, well, I got A's in writing in school, and I had written many, many reports and papers for my work. So I knew how to put together a coherent sentence. And I thought, well, that's probably good enough. And that was not the case. And in trying to write memoir, I had no idea how many techniques of fiction needed to be worked into that, and how my understanding of how to write a story on a high school level was not going to cut it for writing this memoir. So that was a big thing. And another thing was I had no intention of making writing a career at that point. So I wasn't really digging into it as much as I should have. And I just wasn't taking it seriously, I guess. It was just, this is some kind of hobby I have when I'm done with work, and that's cool.
So I wanted to come back to something which is YA, young adult, for people who aren't familiar with the initialism. There are genre conventions across the board, whether you're writing romance, historical fiction. YA is really unique in that a lot of YA readers are actually not young adults. They're people in their 30s and 40s. I have friends who are avid YA readers and writers for that matter. Can you talk about some of the YA conventions, if there are people interested in writing that genre, some of the conventions you need to be aware of?
That's a good question. And I'm still trying to figure it out for myself. When I got into it, I thought, well, young adult means this is written for people 12 to 18. Then I heard, no, this is because the protagonist is between 12 and 18. And okay, so that's making more sense. And I love reading YA. And I found that there's kind of two kinds of YA. And this is just my own observation. So anybody is free to disagree with me. There's some YA where the protagonists really are acting like that age group and not particularly mature people in that age group and stereotyped in that age group. And then other YA where you're seeing that person as what an adolescent really is somebody that one minute can be very mature and the next minute not. And they're in that state of inner conflict and growth. And I'm trying to think of some of the tropes of YA. A lot of people say it's that hero's journey. They're at one place and they refuse that call to adventure, and then they go off and they learn and grow from it. And they have some fatal flaw that they are completely blind to, and they get over it. Beyond that, I'm still trying to figure it out.
I think it's a tough genre to write because we're usually the people writing it are not young adults, or if it's middle grade MG, that most of us aren't 10 years old. One of the things, and maybe this is a stereotype you can dispel for us, is that a lot of writers who aren't familiar with either writing or reading YA think it isn't emotionally dense. There isn't a lot of surface area to it. Is that the case? Can you kind of dispel this myth? Because that's exactly what I think it is.
I think that's true for some and not true for other. And there's a big diversity within the YA field. I've been reading more and more of it, and some of it is very emotionally dense, as you say, and very heavy, and some really horrible things happen. And then others, it's much more, it's lighter. There's a much lighter feel to it. It's almost the same as going between maybe a fairy tale fantasy and dark fantasy. And there's those two sides to it. So that accusation that YA fiction is not emotionally dense, I think it's true of some, but a lot of it, I don't think so at all.
So, testing the waters, Evelyn, baby steps that you took toward becoming a committed writer, workshops, speaking with people already in the know, things like that.
Well, I just dove on in and started writing this memoir I had been compelled to write. It was a slow process. My first thing was arranging for a friend of mine from Russia to go to Ukraine to interview the family. And then she sent all these tapes to me. And then it took me a year to translate them. And the funny thing was, part of it was sometimes when the family was talking about the most interesting thing, like the KGB coming to the door, they'd talk really quietly so that nobody could overhear them. So I'm like,
Oh,
no, I can't hear you. But anyway, then I started putting the story together and I got intrigued by the process. It was like putting together this gigantic puzzle to make all the pieces fit together so that the story flowed and had layers and read well. Well, I was kind of struggling along and then I got some unexpected help. When I first agreed to do this memoir and we were talking with the family, we were talking with the daughter, she said the first thing she said was, "I hope nobody dies this time." We were like, what does that mean? So she explained that some years earlier, she and her husband had met a man, and he was a professional writer and was very interested in writing their story. And he had done a lot of research and had written, I don't know how much. And then he died of cancer, unfortunately. Well, around the time I was getting going into writing, this man's daughter got in touch with me. She was also a writer, and on his deathbed, she had promised to finish his book. And for 6 years, she hadn't done it for various reasons, some personal reasons and other things going on in her life. But she decided the time was to do it. And she got put in touch with me. And that was a huge help because every week we'd talk on the phone for 2 hours every Wednesday night. And we would be emailing back and forth sections of the manuscript. And she was really helping me explaining, why you need more detail and what you need to do with this dialogue and how to make this flow and structuring the whole thing. So that was like getting free coaching. That was really huge. And that's through her help and her encouragement, I started to think I might actually be able to do this.
I started a writers group about 2017 and ran it and obviously participated in it for about 3 years. That was an education. I learned so much so soon and it was brutal. I mean, I really got my ass kicked. When you first started attending writing groups, did you feel like you almost had kind of a head start because of that process with this woman you were collaborating with?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I joined some online and some in person. So the first in person one I was at, I could see a big difference between my writing and some of the other people. A lot of people started things just the way I would have in high school with a big, long, flowery description about whatever was going on. And then 3 page later, we meet a character. There was an online group I joined, and that was helpful. There were some really talented writers in that group. One of them told me, "Your dialogue is on the nose." And I didn't know what that meant. So I had to look it up. And then when I did, I thought, okay, I think they're right. So I bought a book on dialogue and I started really trying to figure out, how do you write dialogue that really feels natural and isn't on the nose, as they say. The writing group, and now I'm involved in two other writing groups. Both of them are virtual. One of them is an online forum. The other one is through the South Carolina writers, and they have a virtual group for science fiction and fantasy writers. And so we meet once a month and just share a few pages. And that's more like coaching. And there's some incredibly talented people in that group. So that's very helpful. And they're much more brutal. And it's much more brutal to be sitting on a Zoom call and somebody saying, "I really don't like this of your work." And they're not being quite so diplomatic, but it's good. The one that I do the most on is a online platform called The Right Practice. And I post a chapter every week, or so many thousand words every week. And a couple things that does for me, I post on Fridays. That's my deadline. So I have to have at least edited something enough to be good enough to post every week. And that really keeps me moving. If I get nothing else done, that happens. And then the idea is you give feedback to other people, but I'm getting feedback of a fairly early draft. It's not my first draft. It's more like a second or third draft. And the value there is I'm getting people who are reading along every week, and some of them aren't, but they're telling me what's working and what's not. And do they like the people, and are the characters making sense in what they do, or does this just not make any sense at all? And that kind of feedback is extremely helpful. And also the things like, this is working. And then you run into the problems where, like last week, I posted something and 2 or 3 people said, "Oh, I really like the banter between the guy and the girl," and then somebody else wrote back and said, "This is really high schooly flirtation." And I'm like, "Okay, well, they are 18, so I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's all bad." People are gonna have different opinions, and I have learned that the outlier opinion is probably the one to really think about. They might have a point in all of that, that can take things to another level. So I highly recommend in getting regular feedback. It makes all the difference in just keeping going and staying motivated.
Yeah, it's tough doing it online. You can't reach over and start strangling them either.
Right.
You don't get it, it's show don't tell. It gets explained later in the novel, just be patient.
Oh, show don't tell. Oh my gosh. If somebody says that to me, that's when I want to start throwing things because it's kind of like, you don't think I know that? And also, that is so overused. Sometimes telling is okay and it is a choice.
It seems like everybody I talk to, myself included, have encountered all kinds of setbacks on this journey. For you, Evelyn, what kinds of obstacles started to present themselves as you really started to dive deep into writing as a profession?
At first, a big thing was time because I was working full time and just writing in the evenings or on weekends. There just wasn't a lot. And that first book, I was trying to communicate with people who were in Ukraine and get information, and that sometimes was a long thing. And the thing with memoir is you do have to stay true to the memories of the people that you're writing. It's not like biography where you're guaranteeing perfect historical fact, but you do have to stick to their memories. Whereas a lot of times it would have been a lot easier just to make something up. And then all through it, all the way through it, I kept having doubts. How good is this really going to be? Is this really worth doing? I would have bursts of enthusiasm about it, and then I'd have times of like, I'm not sure I'm going to do this. But the woman who had talked me into it had put up some money. She had flown me to Ukraine to do some interviews, and I felt like I had taken her money. I needed to finish the project. So sometimes it was just sheer stubbornness that kept me going, and I was determined to finish it.
Yeah, that financial aspect, it's real. I've done editing contract work, and I wasn't always in the mood to edit, but this person paid me,
Hmm.
and I have a financial obligation. I want to go into the memoir aspect a little bit because aside from a lady, she actually had a terminal illness, and so she was writing her memoirs in a writing group. I was a part of it prior to the one I started. In terms of ethics, because I really am just asking, I have almost no understanding of how to write a memoir other than every president decides to do it through a ghostwriter after they leave office.
Right.
This person divulges all kinds of personal information. What do you decide to put into the memoir? What gets cut? Is it kind of case by case? How do you go about writing a memoir in a way that's authentic, honest, but also ethical?
That's a good question. For the Ukrainian family, what I did, the daughter came over and we sat down and we read through the whole manuscript together. I just let her approve it. And there was really nothing she wanted taken out. She had minor changes. I also, a few years after that, I was a ghostwriter for someone's memoir. And she told me all kinds of things. And some of the stuff that I thought was really the juiciest stuff, she refused to allow in there because she did not want to offend other family members. And I had to take it out. We went back and forth and we found a way to allude to some of those incidents without saying it. Yeah, it's really their story and it's their name on it, so they make that decision. And it makes it hard because sometimes for the story, you're taking out a climactic moment or a major turning point and it's not there anymore.
So it's go time, going pro. You've been balancing the work slash creative writing aspect that it seems like a lot of us have to initially juggle. For you, Evelyn, when did you realize you had gone pro as a writer?
Well, it did take a while. So at one point, while I was working on my first book, that first memoir, I got married. And about 6 or 8 months after that, things were not going well at my job. My boss had left, and I was very unhappy there. And my husband said to me, I'm tired of hearing you complain about this. If you don't want to work anymore, then quit. I was like, okay. I'm not going to turn that deal down. So I stopped working, and his youngest daughter was living with us at the time. And we felt like it'd be a good idea for somebody to be home for a few more months till she finished high school, and then I'd think about going back to work. So I used my time to hit that memoir hard to get that into a better place so that it could be published. But I never did go back to work for various reasons. One of them because I could never figure out what I really wanted to do. So I just kept writing and exploring how to make a living writing. And I finished Beyond the Rapids and got it published. And then the big moment was when it won a reader's favorite medal. And I was just blown away by that because all those doubts I had about, is this really any good? I mean, some people had read it and they liked it, and I got a few 5-star reviews. And I'm thinking, well, what do they know? I mean, I had all kinds of reasons why their opinions didn't matter and why I shouldn't believe it. But when the reader's favorite thing came out, I thought, well, this was a contest and it won something. So that was a big thing. And that was when I decided maybe I should really pursue this. But at that point, I decided I wanted to try fiction because memoir is limiting in that you do have to stay true to what that person's life was. And I thought, I'm just going to make up my own world and have my own rules and my own people. And that's the way we're going to go. So that's what I did and have never looked back.
So just like the hero's journey we've talked about, sounds like you've gone through your own from who you were at the very beginning, working in healthcare, it sounded like, into breaking through the Berlin Wall and exploring that whole world. Evelyn, what kind of person are you today, not just as a writer, but just as an individual compared to before you started writing, not just at a serious capacity, but just in that beginning stage?
Well, a big thing is I'm not so bound by perfectionism. I've really learned to hang on to the idea of do something that's good enough for now. Get it out on paper and edit it. And there comes a point where you say, it's time for this book to go into the world. It's not perfect. There's going to be mistakes in it. I go back and I look at my earlier works and I can't get 3 paragraphs in where I want to start editing. But in a way, that's good because it shows me that I've grown as a writer. To not be bound by the perfectionism so that you don't do anything. You just got to keep moving forward and say, this is the way it is, and this is what we're going with. Another thing is dealing with criticism and being in all these critique groups and having to smile and say thank you when somebody has just ripped your soul out. you know it's learning to say, they are criticizing what I wrote. They are not criticizing me, even though I bled my heart and soul onto the page. They are criticizing the words and not me. And just being able to get beyond that and to be able to come back to it a little while later and say, okay, is there some truth into what they said? Is there something useful in what they said? And there's always the option that they're completely wrong. And sometimes I decide that. Or sometimes the harshest criticism, I may not have agreed with it, but it made me see something else that I could change in a different way. So making me take that step back has been useful, and it takes some of the sting out of it. And I would have to say that with each novel, I think my process gets better, and I hopefully am getting better at the craft of writing. But the thing is to keep in mind how much more there is to learn and to experiment with, and just to keep trying to do things better and better.
Goodies time. I always look forward to this because I get to learn something new, it seems like. So, Evelyn, what kind of advice do you have for aspiring writers?
I could talk all day on this. A big thing is there is a ton of informational, educational, great material out there. So don't try to go it alone. Get out there and try to learn this. Mark Dawson has self-publishing formula. That is excellent information. David Gaughran, he has a lot of good stuff. If you're just starting, he might be a good one. It's a little bit more condensed and focused. Mark Dawson will tell you everything you need to know. Nick Stevenson is one, Derek Dripper, Joanna Penn has a wonderful blog. Then there's Kindlepreneur. They have so many resources about how to figure out your keywords, how to figure out your categories. They even have a little thing there. So if you have your ISBN and you know the little scam that Bowker tries to charge you $25 to produce a barcode, well, on Kindlepreneur, you can do it for free. So that's just another little tool that's there. Then there's a few methodologies out there that I have really used a lot. One is called StoryGrid, and they do a lot with story structure. And KM Weiland has an excellent resource called Creating Character Arcs. And between the two of them, I use them to outline my stories. I am a plotter. Between the two of StoryGrid and the character arcs, I have a pretty good outline. It changes. I'm doing the first draft of a new novel, and I've already chewed up a whole section of it and reworked it now that I got to that point. But if I don't have a target to shoot for, I just can't write. I don't know what I'm doing. There are two websites. One is called Writer Beware, and I think that's the science fiction and fantasy authors. And the other one is Predators and Editors. And Predator is spelled like editor with PR at the beginning. Their website is down. They are under new management, but they do have a Facebook page. Both of them do reviews, editors, publishing companies, all kinds of things. And it's very worthwhile before signing a deal with anybody to go take a look at those websites and see what they have to say. And somebody may have already asked them to investigate a publishing company or whatever. Those are great resources.
So that's kind of looking at editors that have been, or publishers that have been blacklisted you may not have heard of.
Right. Or, there's a lot of people that say they're hybrid presses, but they're really vanity presses, and they're going to take your money and not do anything for you. Or publishers, even some legitimate publishers who went belly up or have stopped paying royalties. Well, that's a red flag, and you may not want to sign with them until that's resolved. So there's just a lot of good information there to check out. And it also, by reading those reviews, it helps you understand, okay, these are the questions I need to ask before I agree to do something with somebody.
I always like to ask about habits. You are a fellow plotter. My story Bible, including my outline and everything else I need to know about my novel, is 185 pages, which is probably a sign of neuroses. I don't know if that's normal or not.
Mine is not nearly that extensive, I can tell you that.
I've totally gone off the reservation. I don't know what I'm doing at this point. But I always like to ask about habits, especially with plotting. Not that this isn't the case with pantsers as well or hybrids. So, what are some of the essential habits that you have?
My first one is, as I said, my Friday deadline of posting on the right practice. That makes me get up in the morning and get going because I have to have something ready. Giving and getting feedback is another thing. In reading other people's work, sometimes it's easier to spot the mistakes in somebody else's work. And in learning to see a point of view shift or some inconsistencies in the writing or whatever it is, it helps me find it in my own work. Or if something's really annoying, like one thing that I think is sometimes a trope in YA, going back to that, is the heroine who is strong-willed and active, and she's always inserting herself to go save the day, but she has absolutely no skills and abilities that would make her do that, and she ends up making it worse for everybody else. And they just say, oh, that's okay, that's you. And she does it 4 or 5 times, and you can't start saying you are too stupid to live and the people around you are too stupid to live. But I'm exaggerating, but I do see that a lot. But you start to see those kind of things in somebody else's work and you say, oh, I need to check my own to see if I'm falling into that.
If you spot it, you got it.
Right. And then the other thing is coming up with some structure for the work. I just think it's important to have a basic structure when I get started because it's a lot easier to add layers and texture when there's some bones to build on. I am in awe of somebody who can just sit down and start writing. That boggles my mind.
It's not a humble brag here, but I typically can sit down to write. But that's because I always journal right before I write. So I've already kind of greased the gears a bit. This kind of goes into goals, though. Daily, weekly, monthly. Why don't you break down for us what it looks like if you're in the process of, well, you are right now, writing a novel? What are your goals?
I have a goal of producing a novel, publishing a novel every 10 to 12 months. Then I work backwards from that. My novels tend to be at least 100,000 words. So my plan is to get that first draft spit out in 6 weeks. Just try to get it out. Then I let that sit, and I usually have another novel in process, so while the new one is sitting, I'm really doing the refining and the fine-tuning and editing of that second one, getting it ready to go to the editor, and then when that's off to the editor, then I pick up the new one again and start working on the second draft. I do set monthly goals and weekly goals. Every week I have a list of what I need to accomplish. And then every day I say, what am I going to work on and what's most important? What would be great if I got to, but it's no disaster if I didn't. So right now, since I'm in the middle of drafting, it's easy to say my word count goal is 3,000 words a day, and I'd like to get up to 5,000. When I'm in editing, that's so hard to come up with a goal. It's not easily quantifiable. Sometimes it takes just a few minutes to edit a section, and sometimes it demands a lot of research or going back and say, did this guy really have blue eyes or were they green? And what was the price of the magic again? And you could just go on and on. So yeah, the editing is harder, but I do set a time limit. I would say I want to get from the beginning to the first plot point edited this week. And that's about as far as I can establish that.
No, you're really speaking my language here. I'm in the middle of that and revising a chapter that's written, saying to myself, well, typically I'm going to write about 3,000 words in a couple hours, but maybe actually rewrite and do 200. Yeah, you kind of have to set for yourself less tangible goals. Like you said, I want to hit this character beat, or I want to get to that line break, or just go through the entire chapter. I've got some shorter ones, which I can edit an entire chapter in a single sitting and not even go through the whole time I set aside for myself. That's a really good point. That's really speaking my language here. Speaking of which, I think that physical and mental health, it's one of the reasons I started this podcast, is just to examine and also hopefully share with other writers ways that successful writers such as yourself have learned to take care of themselves. So what are some of what's kind of the physical and mental health aspect of your life look like in relation to your writing?
A big thing is trying to establish balance. I have heard of people cranking out a novel a month or a novel in 2 months. I don't know what life I would have if that's what I did. I mean, it would be consuming. And sometimes, as it is, my husband says I'm talking to my imaginary people more than I talk to him. So that you need balance. And I have my little routine going. I try to be sitting down at my computer by 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 11 o'clock, I stop. And that's when I either go for a walk or do some exercise video or do some house cleaning, but just get up and move around and do something else. After that, after lunch, then I can come back to it a little bit refreshed. Just getting outside and taking a walk. I see people walking with their phones and they're listening to something, but I don't do that. I just want to hear the wind. And that's like blowing the obstacles out of my mind. And I come back and I have the answer to that piece of dialogue I couldn't figure out, or this is the complication I'm going to throw at them
Yeah.
and not this one. So getting out and doing that is key. Sometimes I found you just have to give it a rest. You get stuck and you just have to give it a rest. The trick to that is that I really need to give it a rest or I'm just not feeling it and I'm just being lazy. Sometimes you have to try to push through. Sometimes I do that and I have surprised myself sometimes. I've said I don't really feel like it and I sit down and have a very productive session. But then other times I have to listen to that and say, no, we are going to do something else today. We're going to spend the day looking at videos about Byzantine history to get some background on my world building instead of trying to trying to pull out of myself something. You have to be really sensitive to that, but at the same time, saying to yourself, this is a job like any other job, and I don't have a boss standing over me expecting results, but I am expecting results. So I have to try to push for some of it.
You're absolutely right. The accountability aspect is a lot of writers talk about the issues they have with procrastination. Really, what they're talking about is accountability. And what you're saying about going for walks, my God, the number of plot holes I have solved. One thing I really like to talk about, and it dovetails into the physical mental health, is meditation, mindfulness. Is there some kind of practice you have that helps you stay centered?
Well, I pray every morning, and that helps me a lot. Just in talking to God, it's getting to something beyond myself. And in talking to the creator, it's like tapping into this well of creativity that is amazing to me because I suddenly get this rush of ideas and I can't write them down fast enough. It just is an amazing thing. And so that to me is really key to stay connected to that. Another thing is doubts, I think, plague every writer. And one of the things I've learned to do is to give myself a little distance from it and say, is this true? So when I think to myself, this draft is terrible, I have to think, okay, is that true? Well, maybe right now it is, but I have produced other works that at one point looked like this. It doesn't have to stay like this. It's not always going to be terrible. Or if it is terrible, I can fix it. But to not get mired in it's terrible and the world has ended and I'm a failure. That was something I learned long ago. Just this whole idea of telling yourself the truth. Like you get to this mood of everybody hates me. Well, you say to yourself, is that true? No, that person is mad at me. They might hate me now, but there are 11 billion other people in the world and they don't hate me. So let's not go crazy here. So that's the thing with the doubts. It's just, is it true? Is this really true? And what can I do about it?
I mean, this is what I tell myself, and I tell my students the same thing in that same vein of, is it true? Is it kind? Is it helpful? And another thing I always try and remind myself is our emotions aren't necessarily truth.
Right.
I could have plans with a friend to hang out, and then he's 3 hours late, and now I'm pissed. We made plans in advance, da 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 da. And then I get a call from a mutual friend who says, "Hey, Ted is in the hospital. He was in a terrible car accident." Now, I was angry and I believed my anger to be valid and true. You can also, as a mindfulness activity, immediately notice the pivot of how all of a sudden you went from being furious to hyper concerned. Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, is it true? And it's easy to forget to ask ourselves that.
Hmm.
One thing I want to definitely get into is advice on getting published, networking, all those kinds of things. Enlighten us. What can you share that will help people who are looking to get self published or traditionally published?
Well, I'm indie published. The reason I did that was that the first book I was writing, I did some research and it was very clear that American audiences are not typically very interested in memoirs of Ukrainians. There might be a little interest right now, but they're more interested in like an American who has gone to whatever country and their experiences there. From all of that, I gathered that probably it would be very hard to find a traditional publisher. And then I heard, well, it takes a year to find an agent and then a year to sell it. And I thought, I don't have time for this. So I went ahead and self published and made a ton of mistakes along the way. But I would say don't be afraid of indie publishing. Yes, there's more work on you, but I think it's worth it. And some things I've picked up along the way, and this is just things that people have told me, is that when you get an agent, that agent is looking to have a long term relationship. They're looking for somebody who's going to be cranking out book after book after book. So if you're not planning on that, then that's not going to happen for you. While the traditional publisher does a lot of things for you, you're losing some control of it. There's trade offs and there's advantages. And I think the stigma against indie publishing has gone away. And there are so many resources out there to help you. It may seem overwhelming, this idea I have to create a website and then I have to be on social media and then I don't know how to get a book cover done and layout and all this stuff. Those guys I mentioned earlier with their marketing classes, they walk you step by step by step. I mean, to the detail. One of them I watched, they're going through Kindle Direct Publishing, and this is how you put your book in. And they're going through every single question on the Kindle Direct Publishing site. And this is what you might want to say. And they go into a long explanation of the options and why you would do it this way and why you would do it another way. So you can feel very confident about what you're doing. Another thing is don't go for the first thing that comes along. And I'm thinking specifically about people that offer you publishing packages. That will save you some time and hopefully they are legit and you will end up with a published book. but they are not really doing any marketing for you. And that's why the research into these marketing classes is so useful. For example, a lot of people will say, well, we'll send out a press release for you to 5,000 people. Well, that's probably going to get you zero results because a press release goes to news agencies and they are under no obligation to publicize that. And if you are an unknown author with a book, they are probably not going to give you any airtime on their TV station or in their newspaper. It's really worth it to take the marketing class and learn about it. And I went wide. I know a lot of people, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi genres, they swear by staying on Kindle Unlimited. I went wide and I was second guessing that. And just last fall, I got myself onto Google Play. I had never been on Google Play before. And I make 4 times as much money on Google Play as Amazon. And I don't even know why. I have no idea why. And I'm trying to figure out why, because whatever it is, I'll do more of it. But Wide has its advantages. There is a great Facebook group called Wide for the Win, and they have a book about it and a lot of details about how to make going wide profitable for you. So that's something out there. Another thing I've learned is what works for one author might not work for me. And what works for me this month might not work next month. So it's this constant evaluating the marketing efforts and trying something new and tweaking. And to that end, I would have to say marketing is harder than writing the books. And sometimes it's a lot less rewarding. And the research, people say research, and it's hard to know what that means. I think what that means is look at what successful people are doing and imitate it. So look at the book covers of the bestsellers in your genre and get on the mailing list of some of these authors. See how they're handling it. See what content they're putting out in their newsletter. Is that something you'd want to be getting? Something you want to be producing? And try it. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, then find somebody else and see what they're doing. Kind of imitate the big boys. I have to talk about social media because that has been such a frustration for me. I got a Facebook author page way back when it was just getting started. Unfortunately, I was part of a group where they said, hey, let's like everybody's author page. So I ended up with 350 followers right off the bat. And about a month later, Facebook changed their algorithm. So they only present the content of those pages if you've taken out ads. So now I have a page that has 350 followers. Very few are organic, so very few are actually looking at it. So Facebook's algorithm thinks my page is useless. So, and I don't know how to kick those people off of it, to increase the ratio. That's been difficult for me. Twitter doesn't really sell books as far as I can tell, although I know people that would argue with that. And then there's Instagram. And I look at those pictures that people do, and they have the book covers and the candles and the flowers and the pretty arrangements. And I'm thinking it would take me 3 hours to just figure that out.
Yeah.
And then writing the thing, it's just like, I can't do it. Well, not too long ago, I heard about YouTube shorts. And I resisted TikTok. That just didn't seem like my thing. But anyway, I started experimenting with YouTube shorts. And so I've started a YouTube channel. And now I give a weekly writing update and I do short book reviews. And other than my husband, you're the first person that heard about this because I'm not even marketing it. I'm just experimenting, but I have 11 subscribers. I don't know who they are, but I'm grateful for all of them. And I'm hoping that as I figure this out, I'll start promoting it and growing it. But this seems to be the platform that resonates with me. This was a whole long answer to say, don't stress yourself over social media. If they told me women love Instagram, and if you're writing for women, you have to be on that, and that's who I thought my audience was. But I have more fans that are men anyway. But if the thought of doing Instagram just makes your skin crawl, then don't do it. Just pick a different social media platform, find one, and throw yourself into it. Get really good at it, and then figure out how you can repurpose that content for maybe one of the other ones.
Yeah, and you can always tell when it's forced. Going back to our conversation earlier, when you have to write an essay about something you're not at all interested in, people can tell.
Yeah.
Evelyn Puerto, thank you so much for sharing your preface with us. I already feel like just on the marketing angle, I feel like I've learned a lot here and it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for sharing your preface with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
And there you have it, Evelyn Puerto. just excellent at articulating her experience. I really enjoyed talking with her. The anecdote on the collectif in particular, I found that to be very interesting. I especially like the idea about perfectionism, and just Evelyn's advice in general was excellent. Interesting as well was all the goodies, which I will have in the show notes. But as far as her socials, her links where you can find her, as I mentioned at the top, you can find Evelyn's newsletter. It is subscribe.evelynpuerto.com. She's on Twitter at Evelyn_Puerto. Facebook, you can find her at author.evelynpuerto. Instagram at the Evelyn Puerto. She's on YouTube as well, youtube.com/at Evelyn Puerto author. I really appreciate you checking out the show, whether it's to learn something new, to find all kinds of advice goodies, whatever it is. That's your birthday gift to me. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to all the authors, Evelyn included, who've been on the author's preface so far. I look forward to talking to many more interesting folks. But until then, stay humble, folks.